Welcome back, everybody. We have our next talk coming up. It's Gregor Schumacher, The Future of Open Source, 5 Socio-Economic Predictions.
Thank you. So, hello, everybody. I'm going to start with a short introduction. My name is Gregor Schumacher. I have no engineering background. I have lots of experience in tech leadership roles, mostly at Bertelsmann, a little bit of Accenture as well. And I have been blogging on digital sovereignty for quite a while now. I've become an expert on that. And as a hobby, I've been observing success patterns of big tech. And one of these success patterns I would like to share with you today. I'm not sharing it myself. I found a representative of big tech telling you, Jonathan Ross. I'm not sure is Jonathan Ross well known? He's the CEO of Grok, and it's not the bad Grok, right, with Elon. It's the other Grok. There's another one, and they are competing with NVIDIA. So they have I'm not an expert in that, some kind of AI accelerator, whatsoever hardware.
Sorry, we have to close the window up here.
Ah. Okay, but I can keep talking?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so Jonathan Ross, ex-Google, now for 7 years working on being one of the leading competitors of NVIDIA, and now listen. Oh.
Always. And keep in mind...
No. I have to, the first seconds were important. Try it again.
And open always wins. Always. And keep in mind, Linux won back when people didn't trust open source. They thought it was less secure. They thought the features were worse. It was more buggy, right? And it still won. Now people expect open to be more secure, less buggy, and have more features. So how is proprietary ever going to win?
So remember, he's not like an evangelist of open source. He's just one of the big tech guys. And I was thinking, okay, if he says that, there must be something in it. And I was researching, and I come up with 3 core reasons why open source will always win, eventually at least. And one of the core economic fundamentals of open source is that marginal costs of open source are lower than in proprietary software. So what is marginal cost? Marginal cost, tell you it's going to be a little bit economic today, is the cost of one more unit of output. So you have invested in your machines, you've done all the marketing, you pay for your employees anyhow, and if you not produce this single bottle, how much money do you save? Or if you produce one more, how much more cost do you have? That is marginal cost. And this is one of the core success factors in businesses, especially in scaling businesses. And looking at big tech, one of the core reasons why big tech is so successful is because they play well with marginal costs. Look at Google. What's the marginal cost of me asking for sovereign cloud on Google? It's essentially nothing, right? It's 0.00000 something. Another example, all the freemium SaaS models that we know now, they are only possible because cloud has marginal costs of 0. I mean, cloud, you all know that can be horribly expensive. But the very next transaction you put on the cloud, on Azure Functions, for example, is $0.00026, I think, per gigabyte second of computing usage. So dot, then 4 zeros, and then something. And Salesforce was able to outcompete SAP CRM because they understood how to play with marginal costs. They offered Salesforce for essentially for free, at least for the beginning. Eventually, Salesforce is horribly expensive, of course, but at the very beginning, the marginal cost is super low, and then said, okay, we can offer that for free. And when you're hooked up, then, of course, like by chance, prices and cost is increasing. And now, listen again to Jonathan.
I am completely jealous of that, because if I had that right now, I would open source everything, right? because then you don't have to worry about it and you get everyone helping you, right?
I'm not like later on you're gonna see about whom he's talking, but the relevant sentence is the last one. You get everyone helping you. You have marginal costs for additional features for zero. I mean, what proprietary competitor would be able to have marginal cost of zero for the next features? And remember the first statement of him, how can proprietary ever win if your competitor has marginal cost of zero for new features? Second, and there's one more thing, of course, when you have open source and you operate it, also you have lower marginal cost for operating it, right? So that's another advantage. Next reason why open always wins, at least eventually, is the transaction costs are lower. So what are transaction costs? Transaction costs are the costs that incur during economic exchanges beyond the price of the good or service itself. So imagine I'm going to buy a beautiful small house in Sicily. Houses in Sicily are super I mean, the price is not really high. 50,000 euros, sun always shining, nice people, mostly. And but the transaction cost of me buying this house there, it's huge. I mean, I have to travel there 10 times. I have to have a German lawyer. I have to have a Sicilian lawyer. Maybe like I need to bribe someone on that. So the transaction costs are huge. And that's why I'm not buying a house in Sicily, even though the cost is so low. Now looking at open source, if you are a software engineer in a corporate and you have, because you have to, admin rights on your computer, what are the transaction costs of you trying this new open source software? It's essentially zero. You just go on GitHub, you download it, you use it, you try it. Now imagine you have to pay €1,000 a year for just using that proprietary software. What do you have to do? What's the transaction cost? You have to go to your boss, and the boss says, oh, do you really need it? And then, yeah, oh, we have to make a business case. And, oh, what are the legal implications, etc. So the transaction costs of using open source in corporates, I mean, later on, you're going to produce some costs for the corporate, right? But at the very beginning, the actual transaction is super low. And also managers have low transaction costs in one very specific circumstance, which is if you want to collaborate with an external party. Did any one of you ever try to collaborate with another subsidiary within your own corporate? Did ever anyone? Anne, how was the experience with the tax lawyers? Yeah, it was not a good manager experience here, because if you collaborate on a closed software across different entities, the question is who's going to put that on the balance sheet? And if you do that incorrectly, I mean, you're going to go to jail because you are evading taxes. So it's huge. So you just open source it, and you can collaborate like with incredibly low transaction costs. Also, collaborating with the competition. So if automotive companies collaborate with each other and you don't do it open source, you're going to end up in hell. So 2 reasons. Third one is comparative advantage despite geopolitics. So what is comparative advantage? Another economic basic theory. There are 2 types of theories for economists. The one are super simple and the other one don't work. And this is one of the simple theories, and essentially it's super powerful. So look at Harry. Harry is able to produce 1 table and 2 birdhouses. No, 3. 3 per day. Whereas Lloyd is only able to produce 1 table and 2 birdhouses. If that's what the world does, the world eventually has 2 tables and 5 birdhouses. Now imagine they start trading with each other, which is globalization. Then the world is better off, because then Harry is going to focus on only birdhouses, and the world's going to end with 6 birdhouses. And Lloyd is just focusing on tables, and the world's better off because we have 1 more birdhouse in the world, because we trade. And that's the theory of competitive advantage. And this is happening in the world, at least it has been happening. And that is also one of the reasons why we are so good in hardware, and usually we acquire software from the Americans. And now economists complained about it. I mean, we've been saying, oh, lack of digital sovereignty for 20 years. I mean, we know that. But the economists said, oh, why not? It's comparative advantage, and we are good in hardware, they're good in software, let's just trade. So they thought it's simple and works for all, and now there's Trump coming, and we see it's not working. And Trump, with his geopolitics, has essentially two levers. The one is tariffs, you know, but how can you put a tariff on open source software? They haven't figured out yet. I also haven't figured out. I hope they'll never figure it out. But it's difficult. And the second one is entity bans. So they ban an entity. When they were trying to get rid of Huawei, they said no one is allowed to work to collaborate with Huawei anymore. It was not the underlying open source software that they were able to ban, but the entity. And it's hard to put an entity ban on an open source software. So you are immune with open source, at least almost immune against geopolitics. So three reasons why open source always wins. And what do US managers do with these economic advantages? Google, for example, they started late in the mobile phone operating system market, and then they said, oh, we just open source it. And what happened? You see it here, right? Everyone's helping you. Meta said, oh, we are late in the AI LLM market. And they said, oh, OK, at least we can destroy the business model of our competitor. Then there's NVIDIA. NVIDIA is making so much money, and they say, how can we make even more money? We want to go into industrial robotics. What do? They open source their platform for industrial robotics, because what people will do, they will go online, say, like, how can I prepare myself for industrial robotics? Oh, there's an open source software, and I contribute even to that. It's totally free and open source. And guess whose robots will we eventually acquire or buy? Of course, NVIDIA robots, because the software, I bet, will be more optimized on NVIDIA-based chips. Google entered the cloud market quite late, and it helped a lot publishing Kubernetes under the open source license. You all know that. And there are millions of examples. Now listen to Jonathan Ross again.
OK, so let's start mapping 7 powers to the top tech companies. So I would say Microsoft's biggest strength is switching cost. Right? You look at Meta, it's network effects. They could literally give every piece of technology away for free. I am completely jealous of that.
So he's talking about the 7 powers. What are the 7 powers? 7 powers is a business framework for managers. And they look at the company and they say, OK, what am I about? I'm Meta. What's my core? And they see my core advantage is network effects. Is it then important to own Llama in a proprietary mode? No, of course not. So they freely open source, and they get everyone helping them. Same for all the others. And guess, I mean, you all know most of the biggest open source projects out there with most of the developers are coming, or at least somewhat supported by American big tech. And they don't do it because they're charities. I mean, obviously they aren't. They do it because they play the game. Open source is an inherent part of the digital strategy game of big tech, and they do it super well, and that's why they're so successful in open source, but also in their core business model. What are European managers doing? I mean, imagine the German automotive industry had open sourced their tech stack 15 years ago, and every one of you could have helped them. That would be an awesome software. I mean, that would be fabulous. No one would ever need to fear Tesla again because they had better software, because we could all help the German automotive industry focus on what they're good at, which is hardware. But German managers, in this case at least, they really failed, right? They failed to understand the power of open source. Now imagine like a quarter of all machines in the world out there are open source. Now, a fourth of the machines are European, and if they had open sourced all of their operating systems, they could create awesome business models around that. I mean, what we think now with Gaia X, and still is a theoretic business model of they have some data, we have some data, and how do we share? If they had played the strategy game well, with all the German and Italian machinery out there in the world, we already would have Gaia X and all the data spaces, etc., because they were in the key of where the data is created, and they could steer the sharing of the data. Of course, using European values as a basis. Right, data protection, etc. Now imagine, take the next one, the German administration would open source all of their software, but not like we telling you, dear open source community, how to develop, but truly open source and let everyone helping them, right? It would be, I mean, we would eventually start digitizing here in this country. Now listen.
It took NVIDIA about, I think it was 7 years to get to 100,000 developers. We're on track to get there in 7 weeks.
And the last thing that we totally underestimate is the power of developer communities. Jonathan, big tech, he knows how important that is. And he's competing with NVIDIA, his biggest competitor, on how fast is he able to ramp up a vital developer community. He understood the value of all the engineers out there. Well, and Europeans, stop talking here. Open source, I think, is a sign of digital maturity, especially of the managers involved. So if managers got the tech strategy game, they open source. They open source everything that is not key to their essential business. They understand what is important for them to win, and often in Europe, it's hardware. Why the heck do you care so much about software? Just open source it and destroy the business model of big tech. We're not doing that. But fortunately, I'm an optimist. If we have to, we can. Right? I think this morning I heard another talk, I think it was Jutta, mentioning that we have to now. And I noticed, I mean, we could see if we have to, we can. It hurts, and it's incredibly expensive if we actually have to do it instead of like we want to do it, but it works. So here are my 5 predictions based on my optimism that eventually European managers will get the digital strategy game and increasing political tensions. Here are my 5 predictions. So open source will keep winning. I'm not saying that because I'm here and don't want to get hurt. I'm saying that because it's obvious the underlying economic basics of open source, they're just overwhelming. Second one, because not everyone will like it and tensions will increase, people will pull open source into that. They will try to figure out how to put tariffs on open source. They will try to figure out how to put entity bans on open source. So there will be chaos, increasing chaos. And one example there where something like this already happened is RISC-V. You say RISC-V, right? RISC-V. RISC-V was the other way, I think. RISC-V, and it's an open source hardware project, right? Mm-hmm. And there was a dirty campaign, I think, a year ago, and eventually they noticed it was someone paying for that campaign, and because for political reasons, and they were trying to protect their proprietary business model, whereas they are destroying their business model, right? So they are playing it very well. I think they moved, the organization moved then to Switzerland and tried to, yeah, you know more?
Yeah, they're based in Europe now, and they're working more on the specification as well. So.
Okay. Third, open source will prevail. There's just no way. Its marginal costs are better, transactional costs are better, and it's way more immune compared to proprietary software towards geopolitics. Then, number 4, I think society will ramp up its support for open source. Also not because they want to, but because it's just, there's so much open source around, it's deeply entrenched in all of our critical infrastructure, and we just need someone maintaining it. And looking at the Sovereign Tech Fund, Sovereign Tech Agency, I think some of them are here today, one of my talk, and they take care of, I think, around 40 projects in 2 years or 3 years. So that's the rate of support they have with their current budget. And I think what they have to do, and eventually we will figure that out, is they need to create a business model around that. So only if you have a business model around maintenance of open source, we're going to be able to scale the open source community as much as we need. And last one, if you look back into history, and 10 minutes remaining, look back into history, then Europe always refrained from turbo capitalism. I know sometimes it also feels like turbo capitalism here, but if you compare it to the United States, it's way better here. And so there's some deep consensus in our continent that you have to get along with each other, poor and rich, and digitally advanced and digitally non-advanced, etc. And I think this culture eats strategy for breakfast. So the culture is so deep, we will figure out a way how we can create some kind of digital social economy, finding business models that support open source, help us maintain it, help us make it more secure. But also managers eventually figuring out the value of open source and playing with it for their, not altruistic reasons, but for their very business economic reasons. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Gregor Schumacher. Do we have questions in the audience? Yes.
Thanks. I'm involved in sustainability efforts for several projects. I believe that managers have generally very well understood the value of open source already, and it's already embedded in everything we touch digitally every day. But those managers are not paying for it in any form because we've given them our best ideas. And everyone is more excited about a new shiny thing than maintaining the things that we have. So there's a huge sustainability problem when those of us building this stuff also need to pay our rent and we can't. How does that fit into your perspective?
It does, because my main argumentation is the underlying economic stuff I mentioned. Marginal cost and transaction cost mainly makes sure that open source is necessary, because everyone will use it. There's no choice. Everyone will use it. Even if they don't want it, they will use it. But they create a problem. And then usually, like, until the problem isn't big enough, no one cares. But right now we're in a situation where the size of the problem just increases. And here comes it's a forecast where, like, I mean, we could say it's wishful thinking, but we use lots of open source and critical infrastructure, and there just needs to be a tiny little bit of regulation that someone who uses open source needs to make sure that this company is able to react quickly if there's a bug. So they can choose either to invest in their own developers maintaining it, or, and here comes the business model, they could pay someone who ensures that if there's a problem, they understand the project and they can quickly react. So, and that is a tiny little bit of regulation, which isn't hurting very much, because open source will still be cheaper than proprietary. And then business models around maintenance evolve. So I think a little bit of regulation is necessary here, but also I assume that also in European bureaucracy, they start understanding how to play the game. And
I don't believe that's a feature of the CRA, though.
No, I'm not into the CRA right now, but I mean, I'm talking strategy, right? 10 years, 5 years, it will pop up. I mean, we can talk in 5 years and see. Yeah.
More questions?
You mentioned the sovereign tech agency and that they're going to have to help projects figure out a business model. Do you have any ideas? Because I'm one of those projects and I'm looking for a business model. So.
No, I think my core message is the sovereign tech agency needs a business model, because otherwise they can't scale. I mean, 40 projects a year. I mean, did anyone count the number of open source projects that are suffering? I mean, it's way more than 41, right? I think they need a business model. And there are state-run agencies around. I think there's a bank in Germany. I forgot the name. Like we can even get credit for solar panels or so. Does anyone know? Yeah, KfW. So they have a business model. They act as a private actor. And I think that's a strategy that they would follow. They should follow. I'm not talking to them. I need to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for the optimistic outlook, much needed these days, I think. You mentioned as one of the benefits that open source is more immune to geopolitics. I'm now thinking about export control, and maybe you've heard that, for instance, I think in America they mandated that no Chinese software may end up in, I think, automated driver and assistance systems. That has an impact on us today, and I was wondering what your outlook would be on that. Will that stay as it is, this regulation, or will open source somehow able to circumvent this? Because I think the fact is that people would rather not use open source than have a conflict with the American export control authorities at this time.
If you talk strategy, and I'm talking strategy here, there's one thing that happens in the short run, and there's another thing that usually follows the underlying economic basics. So take solar panels, for example. The price of solar panels is decreasing a lot. And then, of course, we in Germany, we had our anti-campaign around that. But eventually, like when the prices are so low, people just use it. Right? And I think they're trying to figure out how they can sabotage open source. But I just can't imagine how, because you can change your legal structure, you can just fork it, there's a lot of stuff you can do that's going to disrupt your individual situation, right? But eventually there will be a way around it. I'm quite optimistic. I can't, but I'm not specific here how you're going to manage. And like if they try it on the long, it may even be that in this very case they will manage to kick that specific project out. But if you see again comparative advantage, everyone has to build an own stack, an own proprietary tech stack. It's going to be hugely expensive. We in Europe, if we did a proprietary European tech stack, no open source, no American closed source, we would have to rebuild the whole big tech with fewer scale effects, and we will not pay for that. No one will eventually pay for that. So, in the short run, I can't say anything. But in the long run, just the economics are so obvious. They won't make it.
I have one more question.
This might be a simple yes or no question, but I'm curious if you have been thinking in your research at all about how, from a geopolitical perspective, changes in IP regime management, changes in patent policy, changes in other, you mentioned export control, like how that might impact the business model of open source?
Unfortunately, no, but maybe we can do something together.
There's a great paper to chat with you about.
Yeah. Okay.
Who wants first?
Just wanted to jump on the regulation for procurement of open source software. I think where it should start is governments. They use, we saw from Utah this morning, they try to buy more and more open source software. One of the biggest hurdles to buy it is the procurement framework. There was the consultation on Procurement Act by the Commission, European Commission. I think it closed Friday or something. And this is probably one of the best angles. If we want to build a sustainable open source ecosystem, we need to make sure that government and private organizations know how to buy it and fix this whole pay for one feature and ignore the fact it's going to need to be maintained at some point, or just use because it's free. So I think as an input, that's probably where I would go.
It's also playing into one of my core points. The tech savviness of leadership, top leadership, that is key for sovereignty. It's not actually, we can keep using proprietary closed source from the US if companies know how to deal with technology. And lots of companies don't know how to deal with it. And lots of lots of like public administration officials, they're just so far away from how they could, with simple tricks, how they could procure better, how they could just be more sovereign without any big changes.
One more question. 1 minute.
Okay. So you mentioned about one of the predictions is society will care more about open source. Could you elaborate a little bit? Because I'm thinking like even in tech, people that work in tech don't really understand open source. So how do you see this society caring about it? Do you mean learning more about it, understanding it, supporting public policies about it? So how do you picture it?
My specific, there are two things. The one is, if you really go back into history, the last 200, 300, 400 years, and just saw how the US diverged from Europe, it's just an underlying belief of myself that there is the deep culture of caring at least more about each other, right? And not letting people go. The specific caring I see is just the necessity of ensuring the maintenance of all those open source projects in our critical infrastructure. And because problems will arise. I mean, XC utils is just one of the, I mean, there was a Microsoft developer figuring that out. I mean, imagine like our trade war really escalates and the Microsoft developer notices that, right? So, but we need to fail 2 or 3 times. But then when we failed, people understand and there will be regulation that creates business models around maintaining open source.
Thanks a lot, Gregor Schumacher.